Good evening and welcome to Campus Voices. This is the place where we discuss issues that affect both the UK campus and surrounding Lexington area. I'm your host, Muhammad Ahmad, and today we'll be discussing free speech on college campuses. Free speech has had a continuous presence on campuses for many years, but recently, changes in the social climate have seen administrations move to protect those students who feel uncomfortable around certain forms of speech. But in doing this, universities have perhaps inadvertently restricted the free speech rights of other students. WRFL's Zach Epperson introduces today's topic.
Since the founding of the United States, the freedom of speech has been one of the most heavily guarded liberties the American public enjoys. According to a 2017 Gallup poll, 56% of college students believe that protecting free speech rights is important to democracy. But in recent years, students on both sides of the political aisle have engaged in sometimes heated debates about what kind of speech should and should not be allowed on their campuses. That sentiment concerning diversity and inclusion has resulted in now common items such as speech codes and free speech zones on college campuses, which critics say stifle the open exchange of viewpoints on campuses. For WRFL, I'm Zach Epperson.
With that in mind, tonight we'll be discussing the history of free speech on college campuses, the different views that students share when it comes to the expression of free and sometimes inflammatory speech, and how officials here at UK are protecting the interests of both sides. Our guest today to help break this all down is UK Professor Brian Fry. Professor Fry is a Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the UK College of Law. He's taught there since 2012. Professor Fry graduated with a BA from UC Berkeley, a Master of Fine Arts from the University of San Francisco, and a Juris Doctor degree from New York University School of Law. Additionally, he also hosts his own show here on WRFL. We'd like to thank Professor Fry for taking the time to speak with us today. So, Professor Fry, just to start, you were an undergraduate student at UC Berkeley, which is considered the birthplace of college free speech dating back to the 60s. You went to school in the 90s, and with that said, what was the climate surrounding free speech like then, and how is it different from now?
You know, that's an interesting question, Mohammed, especially because I think that a lot of the questions that people were asking about speech regulation, and in particular speech regulation on campus, were very much in the air in the 1990s. And I, in a lot of ways, think that the kinds of conversations that we're having now are kind of revisiting some of the same kinds of conflicts and problems that people were sort of identifying and discussing back in the 90s, right? And I think it's important and interesting that you know the role that Berkeley and other college campuses played around kind of developing concepts of free speech and free speech on college campuses in the 60s, because we've become so used to the modern concept of free speech protection and extensive limits on the government's ability to regulate people's engagement in speech activities. But they're actually it's a relatively new constitutional development, right? I mean, it wasn't until really the 1950s and 1960s that the kinds of speech protections that we kind of take for granted today actually developed, right? So, you know, this kind of robust speech protection that we're used to is actually relatively new.
Now, you said this is something new that dates back to the 50s and the 60s. How much do you contribute that to movements like perhaps the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War and things that were, you know, of importance of that time?
I think that all of those movements were intimately bound up with each other. I do think that the development of free speech doctrine was part of a broader development in the scope of the constitutional protection of individual rights, spearheaded by the Warren Court and in particular by Justice Brennan, right? So, you know, you can see this increase in sort of constitutional protection of speech, but it's also reflected in increasing protection under the various criminal law amendments, like the protection against the rights against search and seizure, the protection of the right to remain silent, the protections afforded by criminal and civil juries, protections relating to Eighth Amendment rights against cruel and unusual punishment. And so across the board during that period of time, we saw a expansion of constitutional protection of various individual rights in ways and across a spectrum that had not been protected to the same degree in previous years, right? So the pre-World War II court and the sort of late 1940s, early 1950s court was much more deferential to government decision making, and we had a kind of, often it's referred to as like a Thayerian type position, reflected in justices like Justice Frankfurter, right, who tended to defer to government decisions and saw the role of the court not to be pushing back against legislative wisdom. And in the late 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, there was an increase in the sort of vigorousness with which the Supreme Court was approaching its institutional obligation, or perceived institutional obligation, to police individual rights, in particular individual rights as enumerated in the Bill of Rights, but also rights to privacy, right, which were sort of seen as offering additional and more expansive protections against government interference, and are reflected in things like the right to an abortion or the right to use contraception, and so on and so forth.
Now, we just heard Professor Fry break down the history of this idea of free speech. And now that we've introduced that and prefaced the topic, WRFL's Braden Ramsey takes a closer look at the current ongoing free speech debate among students.
According to Vice President of Institutional Diversity, Dr. Sanja Feast-Price, the University of Kentucky has become a more diverse community in recent years.
I can see more diversity, particularly racial, ethnic diversity. I'm also recognizing more diversity among our students with differences with sexual identity and sexual orientation.
This brings many different voices together, all of which aspire to be heard in some capacity. Whether it be regarding politics, oppression, or culture, people who exercise their rights are steadfast in their pursuit of what they believe is a just cause. But some students believe that not all forms of speech should be expressed, as a 2017 Gallup poll suggests. The same poll found that 61% of students believe the current social climate prevents some students from speaking out and voicing their opinions. Free speech zones used to exist for this reason, but they no longer exist on many campuses, including UK, due to various legal concerns. Despite this, the Gallup poll suggests students overwhelmingly support free speech zones. For WRFL, I'm Braden Ramsey.
All right, so Professor Fry, we heard Dr. Price touch on what kind of diversity she's seen, but I want to ask you, what kinds of student diversity have you personally seen on campus in recent years?
Well, I've been teaching at UK for about 8 years, and it's clearly a very diverse campus. And I think the administration, certainly at the law school and at the campus, at the university more generally, is committed to developing and encouraging diversity, both of the people who are attending and teaching at the university, but also diversity in the ideas and perspectives that people express. So I certainly think that that's a value we all share, and I think that the university's been doing a good job in promoting it.
And as we talk about the university and the idea of free speech zones, how do you believe that university restrictions on unpopular forms of speech could potentially affect the learning environment for students?
Right. Well, speech can always be awkward, especially speech about controversial matters. And, when people feel strongly about things, then, sometimes tensions can run high. I do wonder whether the increasing sort of move to expression in through social media and other kinds of kind of non-face-to-face type of interactions might make things like free speech zones a little bit less salient to some students who want to express a controversial viewpoint. But then again, there are many circumstances in which students want to engage in a sort of public and in-person sort of expression of their ideas. And, some people want the kind of confrontation that comes along with that. And, I think the core thing is to ensure that people have the ability to express themselves and speak their minds, but, encourage them to do so in a respectful and reflectful and thoughtful way.
So with that said, from a legal perspective, are free speech zones unconstitutional?
Well, it's above my pay grade, really. Until the Supreme Court has a opinion directly touching the issue, I hesitate to speculate. But I would say that given the trajectory of Supreme Court jurisprudence on First Amendment related questions, that I think there's a non-trivial chance that the current lineup of the court would be likely to say that free speech zones, in the sense of a institution telling students where they are and are not allowed to engage in especially protected political speech, and especially if it happens to be on a kind of a viewpoint-based sort of basis, I think would very likely to be found unconstitutional by the court, for better or for worse. Right. And I think that's especially true when it comes to a public institution